Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the next match, round 2 of the playoffs of the Tournament of Heroes. My name is Vegathron and you join us for game 2 of the tournament, where we'll be witnessing a showdown between Mina from Noita versus the Beheaded from Deadcells. The winner will move on to the quarterfinal stage, while the loser will be eliminated from the tournament. If you haven't watched game 1 with Zero from Katana Zero versus Huntress from Risk of Rain 2 and don't want the results spoiled, I'd urge you to go watch that video now before continuing on with this one. Now, let's take a closer look and compare our fighters and their abilities. Mina's special ability is Holy Mountain. At set intervals, Mina will arrive at a Holy Mountain, fully restoring her HP, gaining 25 maximum health, and cleansing all debuffs. In addition, Mina upgrades all of her wands, empowering her moves or outright adding new ones. And on top of this, she'll also gain a random perk. All of these upgrades and perks are determined by what was available during a real Noita playthrough. Although early on these Holy Mountains are quite easy to get to, the first being on turn 3, the gap between each one becomes longer and longer as the match progresses. Mina also has access to some digging spells that not only do damage, but also reduce the turns required to the next mountain. Although if she overshoots, the gods will become angered and she'll receive a penalty to the healing she receives at each Holy Mountain going forward. While this ability feels incredibly busted, Mina starts off super weak in both health as well as damage, and needs to do her best to survive until she can get a decent wand and more health. The Beheaded has 2 special abilities, the first of which is Scroll of Power. Every 5 turns, Beheaded will come across a Scroll of Power, offering a choice between Brutality, Tactics or Survival. Each give him a different stat boost and determines the weapons and abilities he has access to. Each time he receives a scroll, he'll also get to pick a mutation and has a chance to get an extra effect on each weapon, such as burning. This can occur a maximum of 3 times per battle. Beheaded's second special ability is Recovery. When taking damage, Beheaded gets 12% lifesteal on his next attack, as long as that attack happens within the current or next turn. Beheaded is able to adapt to situations on the fly by picking different scrolls and thus getting access to different weapons. Combined with his chunky health pool, potions and recovery ability, and it makes him a tough foe to take down. And now, with the introductions over, it's time to get game 2 of the Tournament of Heroes underway. And there we go. Mina pulls out the victory and will be facing Zero in the quarterfinals. If you weren't sure on how any of the moves worked in this battle, here is a quick summary of them on screen now. And in the meantime, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for Game 3 of our Tournament of Heroes, where we'll see a clash between the Drifter from Hyperlight Drifter versus the Terrarian from Terraria.